the subject of the sensational media. In my experience, bullying happened to some trainee soldiers or some new soldiers to their regiment after basic training. A lot of the people that were bullied should never have been soldiers. In the savage world of war or combat confrontations, there is no room for weak soldiers who may cause their peers to be injured or killed. However, this story is about a particular regiment, beloved by some, escaped from by me, where bullying and a mafia of gay rapists held sway. In order to be objective, I am going to talk about the statistics available, but I am going to push back against EDI that seems to insist that all gay people are made of rainbows and smiles. The events I observed are anecdotal and easy to deride if one wants to do so. I don't care. I'm just telling my lived experience, some light, but a lot of dark. Bullying in the military is a real and documented issue across many countries, and most armed forces today formally recognize the problem and have reporting systems in place, even if enforcement varies. In the late 70s and 80s, no such reporting systems existed. However, I do not believe that the beasting soldiers endure when training or when joining any elite units can, and should be, characterized as bullying. Some dark events have occurred in the British military: verbal abuse and humiliation, sexual harassment or assault, and social exclusion and intimidation. There are places in the British Army where the line between training, discipline, and something far darker has been crossed. At Deep Cut Barracks, a training depot of the British Army, young male recruits, many of them barely out of school, found themselves in an environment where bullying was not an exception, but, at times, part of the air they breathed. Investigations later uncovered a pattern: intimidation in the barrack rooms, violence between recruits, and sexual coercion that was rarely reported, and even more rarely punished. The chain of command failed to see it, or chose not to. Further north, at the Army Foundation College in Harrogate, boys aged 16 to 18 entered the Army with expectations of structure and purpose. Some instead encountered a brutal hierarchy among themselves. Stronger recruits dominated weaker ones. There were beatings, sustained bullying, and episodes of sexualized humiliation, acts carried out not always in secrecy, but often in plain sight of peers who understood the unspoken rule: endure it, or become the next target. Beyond training, in operational units and barracks across the United Kingdom and overseas deployments, a different but related pattern emerged. Young soldiers, new to a regiment, unknown, untested, could find themselves singled out. In some cases, groups formed around dominance and intimidation. A single individual might be isolated, threatened, or assaulted repeatedly. Testimony presented to Parliament described incidents where a soldier was held at knife point by others in his own unit, threatened with death, and forced into submission. These were not battlefield enemies, but fellow soldiers. Most regiments has some kind of initiation, usually benign, but when initiation involves forced nudity, physical assault, and sexual humiliation, this is where the sexual predators prowl. Officially, such practices were condemned. Unofficially, they persisted. Alcohol often sat in the background of these incidents. Barrack room drinking lowered inhibitions and sharpened aggression. What began as banter could turn, quickly and without warning, into violence. Accounts describe soldiers being beaten with improvised weapons, bed frames, poles, whatever was at hand, or dragged across floors while others watched. The boundary between rough camaraderie and outright assault was for some easily crossed. What is perhaps most striking is how much of this went unreported. Male soldiers, particularly young ones, faced a dilemma: report the abuse and risk isolation, ridicule, or damage to their career, or endure it in silence. Many chose silence. As a result, official figures only ever captured a fraction of what was happening. This is not the story of every regiment. This is only my experience. Basic training. During basic training in London, there were always a few who wanted to be soldiers, but simply couldn't carry the weight of it. In Arnhem Troop alone, about 40 young men, you could see it early. The strain, the doubt, the quiet unraveling. Some were already falling behind, struggling to meet the standard. Others somehow made it through the system and found themselves posted to regiments where they never truly belonged. They were there in body, but not in spirit. Before I joined the army, I had been deeply involved in sport. I was fit, prepared, and ready. For me, basic training came naturally. I thrived in it. Not everyone did. The two corporals in charge of my floor were formidable men, drill instructors in every sense, hard, relentless, and often crossing lines that today might be questioned. But there was something else there too, something unspoken, a kind of recognition, respect perhaps, earned the hard way. I stood 6'5", hard to miss. My closest ally was Sean Brown. We moved through it together, and because we laughed, because we didn't bend easily, we were often singled out, punished as a pair. It became a kind of routine. They even gave us the same nickname, having discovered I had cousins in Johannesburg. It amused them. There were moments, though, when the humor drained away. I saw some men reach breaking point. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in ways that stayed with you. One lad couldn't even manage a simple forward roll. It sounds trivial, but it said everything. He was completely out of place in that world. Still I loved it, the chaos of it, the running, the shooting, the inspections, the constant pressure. It was relentless, but it felt alive. I passed a selection in London that marked me for a commando unit. That was the path I wanted. But early in the course I was injured. Just like that, the direction changed. I was sent elsewhere, assigned, not asked. A regiment I hadn't chosen, but one that now owned my time. That's one of the truths of it. You sign your name, and from that moment on, certain decisions are no longer yours. Joining a regiment. Civilians may imagine that once soldiers complete basic training and are sent to an active regiment, they are welcomed as equals by the soldiery with whom they have joined. This is often not the truth. Some recruits are forever shunned, bullied, abused, until usually they are either discharged or transferred. I watched several young soldiers who did not fit in get physically beaten until they were discharged. I watched a young soldier be dragged from his bed and thrown out of a window, ending in serious injuries. A guy who was in basic training with me was shackled to the back of a 4-tonner, dragged and beaten across a gun park. I was never bullied, but I was not part of the in crowd of the troop, battery or regiment for a long time. I admit that I was young, new and avoiding conflict, and sometimes I did not intercede when serious bullying was happening. I'm ashamed of that, and wish I had been more courageous. Here's the story of my first year in the penal regiment that was apparently not allowed to return to England. When I arrived, the regiment seemed like Dante's Inferno, in which several psychotics and gay rapists prowled the corridors, entering whichever room they wished, and interfering with any person they wished. The barracks were an old, ancient WW2 Wehrmacht accommodation. Dark, dismal, dirty. After a weekend, the corridors were at least 3 feet high with beer cans and bottles. I was surprised by the huge amount of booze the denizens of hell drunk. As soon as work ended on Friday afternoon, one of the demons would head to the Naffy and buy 4 times 2 liters of Asbach Uralt brandy and a crate of Coke, about a times 24 trays of beer, and the room of guys. 4 of them would drink it all between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. After this, they would head to the troop bar. There was a real bar on each level of the hideous barracks. Booze of all kinds were very cheap. About midnight they would all go to Senelager, the strip, and get smashed and cause fights in places like Love Story, Scotty's, etc. When I start drinking, my favourites were Zum Towers and Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's for a later story. 10. At the time I didn't drink, which alienated me immediately. I preferred to go running, save money and take home leave as much as possible. In fact, if I'm honest, I was arrogant, and looked down on soldiers that were unfit, and avoided as much physical training as possible. I had joined the army for adventure, not boredom, to wind. Looking back, I did not try to build the vital comradeship in which the army functions. There were good soldiers in the regiment who moved in different circles to new guys like me. I was lucky to meet some of them later. There were some violent episodes I saw. In a way I was reminded of Lord of the Flies, in the way groups formed, grew, and the inherent violence that ensued. Some seasoned soldiers were clearly psychotic. I remember a diminutive, shaven-headed drunken ape. Let's call him Jimmy. His Glaswegian accent was incoherent, and although fortunately he was not a gay rapist, he loved violence. I watched him attack a few young soldiers with anything from broomsticks, bed ends, or bumper poles, always weapons. In the first weeks of being at my regiment, I went on an exercise where I spent most of my time manning a machine gun, while tanks and self-propelled guns roared past me for hours. We were all bivouacked in separate bashers, but close together in a non-tactical patrol base. In the middle weekend of the exercise, most soldiers were conveyed back to the barracks some hours away. A group of soldiers were engaged to stay behind and ostensibly guard the vehicles, weapons, etc. I was one of the remain party. No officers remained. Within 20 minutes of the main party leaving, both Jimmy and a lot of his ilk drove a Land Rover to the nearest town and came back with massive amounts of booze. They built a bonfire, and even though I stayed away, I could hear their infernal reverie all night. Younger guys than me who had joined the regiment recently were foolish enough to get involved, and I could hear whoops and screams of pain all night. It sounded like hell. There were a few seasoned soldiers who, whilst ribbing you, gave off a dangerous violence and a disquieting air of sexual predation. The way they looked at me during their kicks was definitely not right. I avoided all those types like the plague. The gay plague. Banter and physical rough and tumble sometimes had a darker aspect. A push from a veteran soldier became a slap on the arse from a member of the gay mafia. Tja, Nanson hen. There were many times when I was a sprog or raw recruit, I noticed that some more senior soldiers looked for the opportunity to grab an opponent's arse or some other slightly weird behavior, all hidden under the game of being tough or putting the recruit in their place. One of those places were called Shut Up. In my first few weeks I lived in a 10-man room just like in basic training, except that the soldiers I was sharing with were the dregs, the old soldiers never promoted, alcoholics and rapists. They would often come back to camp very drunk, and even at 3 a.m. turn on all the lights, and continue drinking or playing cards. The black guys played dominoes, calling them D-stones. I complained only once and almost got hammered by a few of them, and again the threats held the hallmarks of sexual predation. A senior soldier who was part of the group of skiers or runners to which I later belonged, told us the story of how a sergeant, let's call him DB, had gotten serious burn wounds on his throat and chest. During a non-tactical exercise in Otterburn during midwinter, the battery had been bedded into large tents, and in each tent was a huge petrol boiler, metal on the outside, no guard, blasting out heat. One night our friend awoke from a dream in which someone was giving him a blowjob. As he awoke properly, he realized it was Sergeant DB, who said he was drunk and apologized. Being a gentle soul, our friend left it at that. However, the next night he awoke to the smell of burning bacon, his term, and realized that Sergeant DB had drunkenly fallen asleep with his arms and chin on the top of the petrol heater. Our friend said, "It took me a while to get out of bed to help him, 'cause it was so cold. Another bombardier joined my troop from another, and was bunked in a 2-man room with Sergeant DB. After dumping his gear, he approached a number of us, and said that under DB's bed he had seen a dildo with shit all over it. He was shaking as he told us what he had seen.